Walter, your introductions are magnificent. I feel affirmed. I feel my self-esteem has risen for the entire academic year now. It's always a pleasure to come back here and to be part of what Walter has created, which is quite extraordinary, raising the prominence of the humanities on campus. And he just does a spectacular job at it, in addition to being quite an extraordinary host. What's interesting, if we look at the derivation of host, in English, it's very interesting. It comes from Latin, and it means simultaneously host and guest. And so the question becomes, not only that, but the question becomes, the secondary meaning is also enemy. So you know, the word hostia in Latin has these three different denotations. What does an enemy have to do with a host and a guest? And so what I find very interesting is when you're really being a host and extending hospitality to someone, what you were saying is, in this space where I am sovereign, you are safe. You're physically safe, you're psychologically safe, and we welcome you. And the enemy part becomes interesting because sooner or later, the person you have invited into your house is going to say something that might be offensive. And maybe he or she is not voting for the same person you're voting for. And then you say, aha, an enemy in the midst. My God, I had no idea. And at that moment, you have to choose again to be a host and to welcome the person, even though he has a different belief system that you have. All this to say, Walter, is that I feel warmly welcomed every time I participate. Thank you. Okay. All right. Good.
I'm sorry.
Not at all. I did it again. That was good. Okay. I'm going to just get over here.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it'll be working fine.
Okay. Yeah, get to it a bit. Shakespeare's Richard III is a play about a man who becomes a terrorist in order to become a king. Shakespeare titled the drama The Tragedy of Richard III, and it is a stunning rendering of suffering and lost possibilities. It is, in addition, a history play because it is based upon real events that happened in the 15th century in England. Each time I read the play and observe Richard's chilling encounters with others, the text provokes this question in me. How can one man hold all these people in the grip of terror? How can a single person challenge the structure of power of a whole nation, violate its patrimony of morality and jurisprudence, immobilize its government and ecclesiastical officials, and become the next leader, as other people watch helplessly? In this presentation, I propose an answer to the question. Richard terrorizes English society by disrupting the cultural awareness of its citizens and entangling them in the politics of memory. How he does this is the subject of my presentation. Before entering the play, I want to do two things. First, give a brief summary and situate the play in its historical context, and second, define the terms terrorism and politics of memory, which are the basis of my analysis. Richard III is a play about the English Civil War that lasted 3 decades, an actual historical event in English history. The war, as it was also called, the War of the Roses, was between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. It was also known as the 30 Years' War and was fought intermittently between 1455 and 1485. Shakespeare wrote 8 plays about events in the 15th century that are implicated in the Civil War. From Richard II, set at the turn of the 15th century with the deposition of King Richard II, and continues through Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and to Richard III, our play today, that deals with the end of the War of the Roses in 1485. All 8 plays trace the genealogy of the English monarchy, and Richard II in the first play, from Richard II, the first play of the series. In Richard II is the first moment of deviation from the hallowed traditions of primogeniture and the divine right of kings, when Henry Bolingbroke, the cousin of the king, unhappy with his leadership, with the leadership of Richard II, deposes Richard and installs himself as the new king. This violation is begun in the first play of the cycle, Richard II, haunts the development in the remaining seven plays until it is resolved in Richard III, when Richard III is killed in battle by Henry Tudor, who then ascends the throne as Henry VII, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. The Plantagenet kings had ruled England for 350 years, from 1154 to 1485. Under their tenure, such extraordinary documents as the Magna Carta were produced, which established the rule of law and protection of individual citizens from arbitrary actions of the king. This document, along with other developments, provided the foundation for England's evolution from a feudal society to the first modern society in Western history. It is the rule of law and protection of citizens that Richard III, usurps when he takes the throne by his use of terror and the politics of memory. There were serious concerns. These were serious concerns for English early modern culture. At the heart of monarchy was the question of legitimacy. Is the king, or the aspirant to the throne, really the genuine heir? Or is he an imposter, a fake, or worse, a thief, a murderer, a liar, a monster? The question was weighted by the belief in the divine right of kings and the principle of primogeniture, both fundamental beliefs that gave rise to English political, civil, and cultural life. In England's hereditary system of leadership, power is transmitted in the royal family to the firstborn son and his progeny, a system known as primogeniture. The belief in the divine right of kings crystallizes the power of the monarchy, for the king was regarded as God's regent on earth, and therefore his decisions were subject to no authority except God. Thus we're brought to the dilemma of legitimacy that stains all the history plays. If the king is a bad king, that is someone who's evil or simply incompetent, do the subjects have a right to depose him, as Bolingbroke did to King Richard in Richard II? But to challenge or otherwise rebel against the king was an act of treason, as well as blasphemy, for it was a threat to the stability of the social order, as well as the Christian belief in the coherence and purpose of divine creation. Given this cultural context, all the history plays are impaled on the horns of this dilemma. If the subjects support a bad king, they might be supporting practices that could harm the public good. If, however, subjects supported an insurgency against a bad king, then they would transgress a divine axiom that might do harm to their private souls. On the horns of such a dilemma, either choice is fraught with danger. Richard III dramatizes Richard's usurpation of both primogeniture and the divine right of kings. Richard's claim to monarchy is tenuous. After his older brother, King Edward, dies of natural causes, there are his two children. And then there is yet Richard's elder brother, Clarence, all of whom would precede Richard to the throne. This, however, is not an insurmountable matter for Richard. In the play, Richard moves through rivers of blood, ordering the execution of 9 people from his intimate circle: his wife, his brother, his nephews, including the heirs presumptive to the throne, smothered at ages 12 and 9, as well as members of his political inner circle. After the carnage, Richard is officially crowned King of England. There is, though, one final obstacle that Richard had not calculated in his quest to be king. Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, a minor descendant of the royal house of Lancaster, Henry Tudor slips away from England as Richard escalates his terror. In France, Henry organizes an army, sails back to England, where he's joined by rebellious barons. They engage Richard and his army at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard is killed by Richmond. The War of the Roses is over. Henry marries Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the houses, the warring houses of York and Lancaster. Henry's crowned King Henry VII, who establishes the Tudor dynasty that rules England for 100 years. Henry VII is the grandfather of Elizabeth I, Queen of England, who reigned from 1558 to 1603. Queen Elizabeth is Shakespeare's queen. who presided over the flowering of English literature that occurred in the 16th and 17th century. With this truncated summary, I want to move into the text by defining the terms of my analysis. What do I mean by the politics of memory and terror? The politics of memory is the way events are recorded, interpreted, retrieved, and communicated by people in positions of power. It is a strategy to advance authority and control and may represent the past in ways that distort what really happened. Politicizing memory is Richard's way to remove obstacles to his accession to the English throne. Richard articulates his version of the truth so cleverly that it affects the minds of others and disrupts their recollection of events. Richard's stories deconstruct memories and interpretations. Then in that gap, Richard imposes his fiction of what happened in the mind of the other. Things are transposed and characters separated from what they believe and value, from their capacity to make sense of things, and ultimately they're separated from who they are. They are left reeling in doubt and fear and lose their agency. They are, in a word, terrorized. For to be terrorized, as Joseph Campbell suggests, is to see oneself as unable to confront the circumstances at hand, and to fear that one's life is disintegrated and will be thrown into chaos, torture, and even death by what is happening. Richard's politicizing memory terrorizes others and makes him the English terrorist who becomes the King of England. As Shakespeare does so often, the opening lines of the play are a flash of revelations about human dilemmas facing the main character. The opening soliloquy is structured in 3 stanzas, beginning on a high note of peace, restored after the Civil War, and turns on a set of contrasts between war and death and peace and life. Then in stanza 2, it uncovers Richard's pain that he has carried through his entire life. And finally in stanza 3, the soliloquy lays bare Richard's plots to become a terrorist. Here is part 1 that sets the scene. Now, is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lord on our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war has smoothed his wrinkled front. And now instead of mourning barbed steeds to fight the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. Here we are introduced to Richard's acknowledging his oldest brother, as king, King Edward, called this son of York, who led his troops to a decisive victory over the forces of Henry VI, the last Lancaster king, thereby bringing about peace, that is, the peace that's transformed society. The trope of love has replaced war. Ladies' chambers, where men caper nimbly, have replaced the battlefield, where soldiers dodge mutilation and death. The pleasing sounds of merry meetings have replaced stern alarms, and dreadful marches have are replaced by dancing and laughter. This is seemingly a glorious time. However, Richard's glorious summer is fiction. There will be no metaphoric burying of discontent, of resentments and hostilities at the bottom of the ocean. Richard is not alone in his discontent. Everyone at court has suffered. They walk through scenes of the play, unwinding and rewinding their bandages of pain from the Civil War, sharing recollections of grief. Some are hoping for a future of stability, but all are wary that more blood is likely to be shed. Everyone has been marked by death from both houses of York and Lancaster. They are all related, all grandchildren or great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren of the Plantagenet King Edward III. They are an extended family of cousins who hate each other. Some are stalking for revenge expressed in curses, imprecations, and schadenfreude that echo in lonely corridors of the palace and lofty estates. And Richard himself, more than anyone, is not reconciled to peace and love. The end of the Civil War signifies for him the beginning of another war, the battle to become king. His tactics will be stealth, secrecy, and duplicity rather than guns and armor. Personnel will be thugs, operating in the shadows of silence, rather than soldiers clamoring on open fields in daylight. And hierarchies of leadership will be replaced by one commander-in-chief, Richard himself. Richard is driven into continued war by the pain of rejection he carries, as he laments his exclusion from society and nature in stanza 2 of the soliloquy. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I, that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I hawk by them. Why, I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and to scan on my deformity. The second stanza turns on the conjunction but, which discloses Richard's anger at having been cheated by nature, feeling curtailed, a failed proportion, deformed, unfinished, prematurely born into this breathing world, half made up, he says, and so lame and unfashionable that dogs bark at him as he passes by. Richard feels excluded not only from human society, but even from the companionship of animals. He is stigmatized by his disabilities, his limp, his scoliosis, his withered arm, and has been rejected by society because of his visible disabilities. Richard's hatred of his body, with his physical dysfunctions, is deep. His obsession with his deformities seems to extend backwards in time to pre-existence, to his formation as a fetus in the womb, the biological moment when the zygote is brought into being, and Richard's body is physiologically determined. Its shape, its vulnerabilities, his height, texture of his skin, all potentially encased in the union of the egg and sperm, guided in its evolution through gestation by his DNA, which determine what he looks like and what he can do with his body. Richard is enraged that nature has tricked him, cheated him of what he should have had, like other people, a normal body, and he cannot accept his limitations. He seems to himself rudely stamped with an ugly body, and therefore a freak, unable to attract love's majesty into his life, and therefore deprived of what others take for granted as normal and natural, love and beauty and the happiness that those things yield. Richard has suffered in a profound way from his stigmatized body, and now the time is right for getting even. He feels that his grotesque body has delegitimized him as a member of the human race. His pursuit of the crown is first a way to prove himself as a leader in his society. As king, he would absolutely be the most important person in his world, someone to be noticed, someone to whom all others show respect, responsiveness, sensitivity, and more importantly, and sensitivity, someone others worry about pleasing. A kingship confers legitimacy as a ruler, and more importantly, as a human person, for it would install him at the center of social life where he could control others. It also gives him power over any who may have hurt him and would offer compensation for feelings of betrayal by nature and exclusion by society. Shakespeare leaves all possibilities for getting even with nature, with society, and with life to Richard's imagination. So in the final stanza, Richard reveals how he will negotiate his way in the world with his wounds and limitations. The circumstances are ripe for getting what he wants. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous by drunken prophecy, libels and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says the G of Edward's heirs, the murderer shall be. Dive thoughts down to my soul, here Clarence comes. So he's vocalizing, he's in this soliloquy, and notices that his brother, who is going off to prison, his middle brother, is approaching. And he's just said here that he's going to set his two brothers against each other. At the end of this first soliloquy, Richard proudly recounts a meeting with his brother, the king, his oldest brother, whom Richard tricks and alarms with a lie about a prophecy. Richard says he heard that an oracle, a fortune teller, predicted a threat to the monarchy from one whose name began with the letter G. The king's younger brother's name begins with G. It's George. And therefore, the king, under Richard's sly tutelage, deciphers the linguistic puzzle and identifies that brother, George, the Duke of Clarence, as the would-be assassin. So accused, the king impulsively decides Clarence must be locked up to be safe then, and then shortly after, Clarence must be put to death for this treason. Here we see Richard's genius for politics. He makes an utter irrational claim, presented in the form of a dark art, fortune-telling, so compelling that it throws the King Edward into terror, his memory shaken, and his moral sense eroding in doubt. The king is disintegrating. He is unable to critically assess the absurd claim of a rumor. Richard's terrifying fable of conspiracy replaces the king's memory of his brother Clarence as a loyal, generous, and heroic man. Qualities he later regrettably remembers after Clarence's murder. Clarence had fought alongside of King Edward and risked his life to rescue Edward from certain death at the Battle of Towton in 1461, when the House of York wins the decisive victory against the House of Lancaster. The action on the field of battle of Edward's brother George saved Edward's life and propelled him to the throne. All of these heroic acts are forgotten, erased in the politics of memory as Richard's tale whittles away the loyalty between brothers and sets in motion the murder of an innocent and generous man. Richard has found the solution to his existential suffering and social marginalization. The terms of choice are clear as he embraces his path of villainy robustly, echoing the medieval allegorical figure of vice that is his ancestor, who delights in causing grief and an inconsolable devastation for other people. Just as Richard suffers no grief for killing in battle, he feels nothing for the execution he commissions as he scorches the path to the monarchy. Delighting in his persona as the coiner of lie and inquisitor of terror, he jousts opponents with the politics of memory. There will be no price too high to pay for the crown, even if it means dishonoring his family's reputation. Richard rolls out tawdry rumors that he has constructed of the bastardy of his older brother's children, as well as of his brother, the king himself. To buttress his claims, Richard defames his own mother, insinuating that she conceived his brother, Edward the King, while his father was off fighting a war in France. Such gossip delegitimizes his mother and pollutes her conjugal integrity, her marital status, and her children. Tell them when that my mother went with child, my princely father then had wars in France, and by the true computation of the time, found that the issue was not his begot. No weakling or self-pitying man, Richard, like Shakespeare's other tragic villains, Iago and Othello and Edmund and Lear, embraces the path of villainy, reveling in the powers that abjures the force of morality and law. He is gleeful as he thinks about his plans for hurting people, those who are in the way of what he wants. There is no boundary he is unwilling to violate, moral, ethical, religious, familial, social, to legitimize himself and control a world that he feels has violated him, shrunken, as he says, his possibilities for fulfillment. He owes allegiance to none but himself. He spares no one, mother, brother, sister, wife, in his quest to soothe his narcissistic wounds. Richard yearns for a world where everything is under his control, where he is subject to no one, where he is in command of everything in life, even his death. He will terrorize the world until he is master of it. Getting even is his personal ontology, as twisted in his thinking as he is in his body. The power of terror and the politics of memory is dramatized in the most wrenching scene in the play that I want to turn to next. Richard brazenly interrupts a funeral procession in order to propose marriage to the woman whose husband he has killed. Anne is the widow of the son of the opposing king, Henry VI, of the House of Lancaster. Both her husband and father-in-law had been killed by Richard at the Battle of Towton. In a stunning act, Richard halts the cortege and dodges Anne's initial scorn and malediction. She calls him diffused infection of a man, hedgehog, unfit for any place but hell, toad, out of my sight, thou dost infect my eyes. Undaunted, Richard declares his love for the woman he has blighted. It is an extraordinary encounter that menaces and entraps the woman. Richard dazzles the angry and grief-stricken wife by plundering her memory and remodeling his act of killing into a frenzied expression of love. Your beauty was the cause of that effect. Your beauty that did haunt me in my sleep, to undertake the death of all the world so that I might live 1 hour in your sweet bosom. Richard saps Anne Marl's categories by his specious use of Aristotle's logic of causality. He implies that while he is the efficient cause of her husband's death because he inserted the knife, Anne was the final cause because she was the purpose for which the killing was done. Is not the causer of these timeless deaths, of these Plantagenets, Henry and Edward, as blameful as the executioner? Richard has twisted the meaning of killing, incriminating the victim as a conspirator. To secure his conquest, Richard kneels before Anne in a parody of the traditional posture of a courtly lover, proposing to his beloved. Unsheathing his knife, Richard opens his shirt to bare his breast, places a knife in her hand against his chest, and says, touch not thy lips with such scorn, as she's cursing him continually through it. For they were made for kissing, lady. He's unstoppable, not for such contempt. If thy revengeful heart cannot forgive, lo, here I lend thee this sharp-pointed sword, which if thou please to hide in this true bosom, and let the soul forth that adoreth thee, I lay it naked to the deadly stroke, and humbly beg the death upon my knee. And so what he does, opens up his doublet, kneels before her, puts the sword in her hand. Well, it's really a large knife. Up against her throat. Just do it. Clean it. Okay. I'm going to go on next. Nay, do not pause, for I did kill King Henry. But 'twas thy beauty that provoked me. Nay, now dispatch, 'twas I that stabbed young Edward. But 'twas thy heavenly face that sent me. She lets the sword drop. And then Richard says, take up the sword or take up me. Richard destabilizes the love of Anne's dead husband as inferior to his own greater love. He imposes his imaginary love in Anne's memory, displacing her dead husband with Richard's fabrication of himself as the better of the two men, whose love for Anne provoked him to kill. Richard ends his performance with the coup de grace to her spirit, the false disjunction, another logical fallacy in Richard's Aristotelian repertoire. Kill me or marry me. That the disjunction is false is beyond her comprehension now, as she is held in the clutch of terror and cannot recognize the invalid argument. She is terrorized, separated from her ability to make sense of things. To kill Richard would make her a murderer, but to marry Richard would make her the murderer's accomplice. She's broken either way. In reality, there are more choices than to kill Richard or to marry him, but Anne can only feel her life is unraveling in Richard's snares of logic. In Richard's debasement of her marriage to the son of the rival king, She fears she can be murdered now with impunity by Richard. No one would protect her. She is Richard's caged creature who will be permitted to live as long as she serves Richard's ambitions. When she's used up, she knows her life will be terminated and is resigned to the horror of marrying her husband's killer. Richard's entrapment of Anne mirrors the hoax that deceived his own brother, King Edward. Richard is the master pretender. He has invented alternative realities for his victims, which twist the memories of Anne and Edward as dreadfully as Richard's anatomical disease has warped his body. Richard's grand talent is his instinct for sensing the flutter of an anxious heart. He penetrates the mind's defenses to handle what is remembered and what is forgotten. Richard can sniff Anne's fear of becoming illegitimate, her royal identity scalded in the new monarchical order. Such women, wives or mistresses of falling nobles, live at the discretion of the victorious crown. In similar fashion, Richard's brother, King Edward, worries about legitimacy, for his genealogical descent is out of order for kingship. Both victims, both King Edward and Anne, are alarmed about the future. To avoid something bad from happening, Anne and Edward surrender to Richard as executor of their destinies. The terrorist redraws their cognitive maps, molests their recollections, then abandons them. The third scene involves Richard enlarging his reach of terror and allowing others to watch his villainy. After the natural death of his older brother, King Edward, Richard called to a meeting the three most powerful ministers in the realm of the English court to discuss the date of the coronation of the new king, whose identity at this point in the play is King Edward's oldest son, who is 12 years old. Richard's secret intent is to have his 12-year-old nephew murdered and thereby declare his path to the throne. The meeting is intended to secure support from these ministers for his coronation, and in this scene, Richard is confident he will get it. The ministers sit around a table waiting for Richard, who is late, their cordiality masking their anxiety. They are Buckingham, Richard's trusted confidant, Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain, who is a senior official who managed Richard's political advisors, Lord Stanley, and the Bishop of Ely, as well as Sir James Tyrrell and Sir William Catesby, two of Richard's henchmen. Hastings, who is a strong supporter of primogeniture, has made clear his support for the young prince, the 12-year-old son of King Edward. When Richard shows up late and without an apology, he's jovial and smiling. It is clear who's running the meeting now and who will decide the date of the coronation. Richard interrupts the proceeding with a request of the bishop to send for strawberries from his garden. Then he turns and whispers something to Buckingham. So when he comes into this space, he controls everything. Doesn't matter what they're doing. Strawberries, he's going to talk about strawberries instead of the serious issue of coronation. And then he, so people are trying to be serious, and he does all of these not so subtle interruptions. Then he turns, whispers something to Buckingham. Then they excuse themselves, step outdoors for a private conversation where Richard informs Buckingham that Hastings is unwilling to support Richard to be crowned king. When Richard re-enters the room, his mood has changed, and he asks the question with dead seriousness about a plot against him by his hated enemy, his sister-in-law, the widow of the king who has just died, King Edward, whom he calls the monstrous witch. Tell me what they deserve that do conspire my death with devilish plots of damned witchcraft, and that have prevailed upon my body with their devilish charm. Hastings very foolishly says, the tender love I bear your grace, my lord, makes me most forward in this noble presence, to doom the offender, whoever they may be. I say, my lord, they shall have deserved death. Then be your eyes the witness of their evil. And he shows his withered arm. Everybody knows that this is a congenital defect, his withered arm. So he shows it and says, look, how I'm bewitched! Behold my arm! is like a blasted sapling withered up. And this is Edward's wife, that monstrous witch consorted with that harlot, Strumpet Shore, that by their witchcraft thus have marked me. Look! Rational men, and there's also a priest there. Oh, I did it again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's amazing, just amazing scene. Here they are, these powerful, accomplished men listening to this superstition, this drivel, witchcraft. They cast a spell on him. Voodoo. Early modern voodoo. Look at my arm. It happens so fast, and then I want you to see what he says. Richard's come back here. Okay. I just want you to see this page.
You better just read it to us.
Okay. Okay. So it says, look at my arm, look at my arm. And Hastings says, if they have done this, noble lord, and Richard turned. If thou protector of this damaged trumpet, talkest thou to me of ifs? Thou art a traitor. Off with his head! Now by St. Paul I swear I will not dine until I see the same. Lovell and Radcliffe, look that it be done. The rest that love me, rise and follow me. So in an instant, we see Richard challenging the structure of power and terrorizing the highest government and ecclesiastical officials who will decide the future of the English monarchy and the state. We watch Richard immobilize them as he violates English law. He asks the group what should be done to those who threaten his life. Foolishly, Hastings is quick to reply. They deserve death, he declares, thereby declaring his own execution. Then Richard recounts his imaginary narrative, a fable of such extraordinary fantasy that it would provoke derision with its irrational and superstitious claims, suggesting madness even. Richard is agitated as he recounts the cause of his grotesque body. The group sits solemn, stunned by Richard's claims. Could anyone believe it? Does he expect the group to believe it? Has he lost his mind? All are too frightened to answer Richard's rant, except the foolish Hastings, who prides himself on his rationality. When he proffers his response, if, Richard is incensed and condemns him as a traitor. Even the gentlest doubt, if, enrages Richard, and Hastings is executed without a trial, without due process, transgressing British political and legal institutions. More devastating is the response of others at the table. When Richard orders Hastings' execution, not a peep is uttered from the group. Not one person stands to support Hastings or call for justice. Not the ministers and not the priest. When Richard invites the group to stand and follow, they all comply like sheep, fearful of being condemned, as well as frightened of what could happen to them if they uttered even one word, if. The scene ends on Hastings' lament for his country and its dark prospects for the future. The final perversion in the scene, Richard will postpone the pleasure of his dining until after he receives the news of the pleasure of Hastings' execution. The realization is growing that no one has rights in England under Richard except Richard. Everyone else exists to serve his purposes. The murder of dissidents shakes the foundation of English civilization. All the men around the table know this, but are intimidated by Richard's violent transgressions. Richard has become the English terrorist who disrupts the cultural memory of citizens. even the most accomplished and honorable. I have approached the play Richard III as a 21st century reader of Shakespeare, living in an America deeply convulsed by the terrorism of 9/11 and its reverberations into the present, even now, in this moment, as we sit in this room where rational discourse is esteemed. I also bring my recollection of the accounts of 20th century horrors, 2 world wars, countless local battles, genocides, ethnic cleansings, and insurgencies, where millions of human beings were mutilated, tortured, murdered, millions left displaced, condemned to abandon their homes and flee their countries. My premise in this presentation has been that Shakespeare offers 21st century readers a way of understanding terror and terrorists. I am not suggesting that in Shakespeare we can find the root causes or solutions to terrorism. That Richard III is an early modern villain and terrorist shaped by Elizabethan categories of culture, race, ethnicity, class, gender, and religion. That is all true. As well, the terrorism of the 21st century is marked by its unique constellation of cultural and material forces that are different from the 17th century in Western Europe. What Shakespeare offers is a way of thinking about terror and its complexity. Marjorie Garber calls this transcultural and trans-temporal sweep of Shakespeare's art reversibility. To be more precise, we can think about Shakespeare's history of Richard III and respond to its brilliance, its richness as an art form. We could also use Shakespeare to think with, that is, allow his early modern version of terror to focus to shift or reverse our focus from the past to the present, rather to inform our reflections of the operation of terror in the modern world. The fiction Shakespeare invented more than 400 years ago can stir in us today the primeval fear of the terrorist as chief of state or leader of the group. Examples abound in developing countries on every continent, from the political left to the right, and every political stripe in between: communists, fascists, socialists, anarchists, monarchists, capitalists, revolutionaries, and so on, invading the private sanctuaries of citizen psyches, abusing and finally killing millions of non-combatants in pogroms, death camps, re-education facilities, horror chambers, even in centers of civility, like public thoroughfares, shopping centers, theaters, and holy spaces, as well as in the remote bushes of the wilderness. Anywhere and everywhere there is power to be had. Shakespeare's representation of the power of the terrorist to bend human minds and shape local or national destiny extends beyond its Renaissance time frame. His characters evoke the motion of terror, given and received, between predator and prey, between Richard and those around him. Shakespeare's genius fuses the local and the universal across historical eras. Richard's appropriating power and controlling people through fear is shared with contemporary tyrants, whom one might call Richard's political descendants in the 20th and 21st century. They are the monstrous heads of state or leaders of insurgencies, strutting and fretting their hour upon the international stage, leaving unfathomable desolation in their wake. Adolf Hitler. In this period, 1934 to 1945, 6 million people, as we all know, were exterminated. One of Hitler's famous quotations: "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." Another quotation: "The receptivity of the masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequences of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. The very first essential for success is a perpetually constant and regular employment of violence." So, Joseph Stalin, 1922, 1952. The figures are rough, that historians who study this area don't have access to archives to be able to get exact figures. So the number of people who were killed, either in extermination camps or through failed policies, as in Ukraine, where there was a catastrophic failure, agricultural failure, and millions of people have died. Between 15 and 30 million people. Stalin. That solves all problems. No man, no problem. So here is one photo from that period of Stalin's solution. No man, no problem. It is enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything. Stalin voting in public. See, we're in a democracy, he said. And behind him is Beria, another high official in the communist hierarchy. Mao Zedong, enormous, 70 to 100 million people. I mean, these are the ranges. Again, lack of access to archive. Died in his, under his command, and less than 30 years. Communism is not love. Communism is a hammer, which we use to crush the enemy. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Peasants during the Cultural Revolution, 66 to 76. Idi Amin, 1971, 1979, president of Uganda. 500,000 people in an ethnic cleansing out of 24 million. Germany is the place where, when Hitler was the prime minister and supreme commander, he burned over 6 million Jews. This is because Hitler and all German people knew that Israelis are not people who are working in the interest of the world, and that this is why they burned the Israelis alive with gas in the soil of Germany. Idi Amin's inspired work and the hundreds of thousands of people who were exterminated in his regime. Pol Pot, Cambodia. In 3 years, forced labor, malnutrition, execution resulted in the extermination of 3 million out of 7 million people in a 3-year period. Half the population, 3 million people, decimated in a 3-year period. And figure out how many people a day had to die. Amazing, it's very impressive. Pol Pot, exterminate the 50 million Vietnamese and purify the masses of the Cambodian people. He who protects an enemy, he who protests is an enemy. He who opposes is a corpse. Killing Fields is what it was called. There's even a film about it in the attempt to wipe out half the population, the whole population. Kim Jong-il, North Korea, inherited in the Democratic Republic from his father. The most important thing in our war preparations is to teach all our people to hate U.S. imperialism. Otherwise, we will not be able to defeat the U.S. imperialists who boast of their technological superiority. His son, Kim Jong-un, who is currently on the throne, president. Nothing is impossible for a man with a strong will. The possible is only for a man who loves the future. There is no word impossible in the Korean language. Now, I had found, finally, I couldn't find any photos online, and then I realized this is North Korea. Do you think they're going to open up the libraries? And do you think they have photographs of all of this stuff? And just late last night I was able to get them, but we weren't able to make it work. Anyway, we all know Assad in Syria. What's interesting is the Human Rights Charter, Charter of Natural Rights for people, 4 big ones: freedom from hunger, freedom from 3 others, but the 4th charter is freedom from fear. That's in the UN Charter. Freedom from fear. So it's an extraordinary thing to say. To officially use that organization to say we are committed to creating a world in which people don't have to be scared all the time, scared that they're going to be tortured and killed. And you've seen this, Aleppo, the beautiful city. Can you imagine? As far as you can see, this is what it looks like. And no water, no hospitals. You don't even see people on the streets. And this was the 2nd largest city in Syria. Khomeini in Iran. The great powers have dominated the destiny of the Islamic countries for years and installed the Zionist cancerous tumor in the heart of the Islamic world. Many of the problems facing the Muslim world are due to the existence of the Zionist regime. It is the mission of the Islamic Republic of Iran to erase Israel from the map of the region. On free elections, the vote cast in a free atmosphere and with all the inclinations and parties at present was, after all, a vote to the Islamic Republic, to national independence, to the Constitution, and to Islamic causes. Free elections, and if you look at, this is a protest, where is my vote? They're asking. It's 2009. Where's the vote? We didn't vote for this guy. Stop the killing. Courage. There was here in Detroit, and 3 years ago, an Iranian woman who is a lawyer living in Paris now, and she spoke here. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, 2005. This woman had such courage. She looked like she was maybe 5 feet, maybe 4 feet 10. She stood up there and said she defended women who challenged the regime, the oppressive regime. And many of them would go to jail, and that's what she did until her own life was threatened for the God knows how many times, but she now lives in Paris. But ferocious in her courage, fiercely courageous. And these women are taking an enormous risk and just standing up publicly in social space and protesting. And finally, Vladimir Putin. Recent picture. There is Peirce, the American philosopher, says that if you're a native speaker in a society, that you understand the code, and excuse me. And so and he uses this as an example, the wink. Notice Putin is winking at you. So he says everybody in a culture, certainly in our culture, in the English-speaking world, understands the difference between this kind of thing, nervous twitch. What's the matter? Oh, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Yeah. And this, when you wink at someone, that means I'm your friend. You wink. Then there's this wink. It's the Russian variant of this when you do this, like that. That means you and I are going to play a joke on him. And so, you can just wink at somebody like that, and we can make that distinction. Well, here he's winking at whoever this is. We don't know who this is. And so here's Putin. On the matter of the 2016 Olympics, this just happened this past summer, we're against doping. Above all, because it's bad for human health. And those involved with doping should be punished. So, it's obviously there was no doping. Picture of an Olympic athlete getting juiced up. On Ukraine, we never said there were not people there who were carrying out certain tasks, including in the military sphere. But that does not mean there are Russian regular troops there. Feel the difference? And of course, there it is. There are not Russian troops. There it is. Caught by the smartphone. Thank God for Steve Jobs. What a genius he was. So if you lie, somebody's going to find out. Somebody is taking a picture. Anyway, Ukraine. Peace. Save us from Putin, is what the sign read. Okay. Thank you.
I have to leave, so I'm not, yeah, great. I need to leave, so I need to ask a question real quick, like, I'm Van Berkeley from history.
Yeah.
The English, I mean, I keep coming back to the problem of memory and disruptions of memory,
Yeah.
which I think is at the heart of what you're trying to do here, yes? And it does strike me that the English have a capacity, because of their history, for extraordinary tenacity in re-remembrance, right? And so, if I were you, I would think very hard about the extent to which memory has really been, disrupted in a permanent way or in a fatal way in England, because memories in England keep coming back, right? I mean, the English are mindful of history, and I mean, what you have is a petty tyrant, in my view, who seeks to make sort of expedient political use of people's short-term memory. But that's not to say they really forgot. That's not to say they really forgot, is it? I mean, they certainly don't really forget
Yeah,
altogether.
what I'm saying is, what I was trying to suggest was the fear is so
Oh, yeah, sure.
overwhelming.
And there's destabilization for sure, and all that kind of stuff. Now,
Disorientation. Yeah,
the second point I want to make before I rudely walk out
Yeah, it's okay.
is that the other societies that you name, I mean, the Pol Pot regime, all the rest, have very different capacities for the remembrance of very different kinds of things. And in fact, in some of those cases, there's no memory whatsoever of anybody's right to be anything at all except a peon, right? And so, I mean, I'm not sure they're analogous. And I mean, the straight line that you're trying to draw, I think, is problematic, and that's just because
Okay,
I'm a
that's good.
historian.
No,
I'm an
yeah, no,
historian
that's
rooted to empirical stuff, you know?
Yeah. No, that's
So,
good, yeah.
yeah.
No, this is not, mine's is interpreted, it's not, it's qualitative. It's-
Yeah, no, I think Richard III was, more like Trump, excuse me,
Uh-huh.
than, you understand, I mean, there's the petty tyrannical stuff, and,
Yeah.
which has terrible short-term consequences,
Right.
but,
And I was interested, you're right, how,
Yeah.
see, for me, it's the solitary leader. How, I mean.
yeah, no, that's important, yeah.
There are all these people, and
Yeah.
particularly that last scene where there's all the representatives from the different domains of society are there. Nobody says anything.
And notice the way memory is resurging even among people short-term in places like Libya. I mean, with signs that say, we want the vote.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you also have, but another conjunction there is with technology.
sure,
Smartphone.
sure. So I was just trying to introduce more space
You did.
between,
Yeah.
okay, between Richard III and St. Pol Pot.
Yeah,
that's all.
maybe it's a little sleight of hand on my part, but as I say, when I'm in the New York Times this weekend, Greenblatt, Stephen Greenblatt has a piece on Richard III
Right.
from his book. Did you see it, Richard III?
No.
And
I know I'm supposed to, but yeah.
and no, and Trump.
Yeah.
That's right, but he doesn't mention Trump by name.
There are
but
all
he's
kinds
talking
of,
about that.
sometimes I think those leaps can be really dangerous because they suggest oversimple solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, the other final point I want to make is that when you talked about enemies and friends at the beginning, what came to mind immediately for me was the old Catholic set of instructions for believers that came to be translated into Anglicanism and into Reformed Congregationalism. In the primer, in the New England primer, it says, for kids who were 3 learning to read, hate no man, love thine enemy, welcome thy enemy. All of this stuff is sort of bound up together in originally Catholic theology, about how it is that your home has to be sort of free of animosity even for one's enemy. So that's not surprising, I don't think. And I don't know if you meant it to be surprising, but I don't think it's surprising.
Well, that's for me, yeah. I mean,
But I think
looking at hospitality.
I think its origin is Catholic and has received into ultimately all these other forms of English-based Protestantism.
I didn't read, maybe it was with you, I know you have to go, but I'm going to read it anyway. I've got a conclusion here that I didn't, I was caught up in the film, but if I can, I know you have to go, so
Okay,
feel free to go.
I've got a student there, but it's fine, keep
Go.
going.
Okay. All of these people are the truth claims they broadcast about halting the development of nuclear bombs, signing peace treaties, enacting social reforms, or instituting human rights legitimate? Are they real? Are they genuine? Or are they fake? Do they believe anything they say? or what is said about them? How do we interpret what they say and do? Do they have the power to control what people remember and what they have forgotten about other people terrorized by leaders who operate as they do? Are they politicians of memory as well as designers of terror? Can terrorist leaders of insurgencies exploit their deconstructions of civil societies into other parts of the world and even invade our worlds? Will they touch us? Terrorists have redefined the meaning of living for millions in their own societies. Namely, to live is to be terrorized. To live is to forget the human. Will that definition become other people's definition, become ours? And will we live as if our world were shrunken to a battlefield, detention camp, trash heap, or precinct of pain? To return to Shakespeare's place in this discussion of terrorism, I refer to Foucault, who identified a rare power in a few gifted people. Exceptional artists, scientists, philosophers, entrepreneurs, to provide the world a new language to enrich our engagement with life. He called this power the invention of discourse. Many artists can bring something beautiful into being and move an audience. However, there are a very small number scattered over history whose imaginative grasp of the human predicament is incandescent. Their achievements break the mold and create a new discourse, a new way of thinking and talking about persons and the conundrums of life they struggle with. Shakespeare is one such artist. So I think I'm trying to say here, not that in Shakespeare there is a solution, and I certainly am wary about oversimplifying. What he provides is not a solution, but a way to think about terrorism. And it's quite, and obviously I'm slipping a little here too, because I'm saying we can even move toward a kind of universalism here. You look at English society and through that filter be able to see what's happening in South Asia or Africa.
I think, in my view, the English solution proves that discourse failed. Okay, and that because in fact the English didn't forget, the English remembered.
Right.
There was, Magna Carta survived.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's not the case in many of these other regimes that you mentioned. So much may depend on the content of public memory in the first place.
Good.
And that may be, okay,
Yeah.
I have to go.
Yeah, we need a, thank you very much. I think we need a kind of interdisciplinary conversation about it. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Any other questions?
I'm also from history. I'm in Dr. Ash's early modern Britain class.
Okay.
So we were looking at Richard, we started with Richard III and Henry VII, and right now we're in Elizabeth. So I've been thinking as you were talking about memory, and you mentioned at the beginning the fact that Shakespeare's writing this under Elizabeth's regime. She's the granddaughter of Henry VII, who overthrew Richard III.
Right.
So it makes political sense
Right.
to cast Richard III as this evil terrorist. But then I wonder historically, if we remember him that way because of Shakespeare's
Right.
way, as opposed to perhaps a more, how we remember Lincoln as a political, backroom deals person,
Right.
maneuvering a system and working in it to get what he wants.
Right. Yeah. You're right. It is Shakespeare's created our understanding of Richard III. His work is based on Thomas More's work.
Mm-hmm.
Moore wrote the history of Richard, and what Moore did was to collect all the folklore about Richard, including including the legend that Richard was born with a full set of teeth. And that's in there, so that he is this monster from the moment that he's born. And what's interesting is in 1213, when they excavated in the city of Leicester in England the cadaver and identified it as Richard II, what was left of his cadaver really showed the effect of,
Yeah, they could tell it was him based on his...
right, but also brutality, that the sword was driven through all parts of his anatomy. But they also found something interesting because there was some concern about whether or not he was really as grotesque as he thinks that he is, but he did have very, very severe scoliosis. And that would have made him what we call a hunchback today. So yeah, Shakespeare, I think there's the power of art to be able to invent history. And Shakespeare invented our history as we know it, of that period of time? Good, these are wonderful questions.
Well, to follow both of those points, and forgive me, I didn't catch her name, Dr.
Van Berkeley-o?
Berkeley-o.
Van Berkeley-o.
Van Berkeley-o? Oh,
Sandra.
Son,
the point that she kept bringing up was the re-remembering, the fact that memory returned to England, that they were able to remember, when in fact I think the point that what we actually remember as Richard III as a villain, as an animal, stems almost directly from Shakespeare's interpretation. So arguably Shakespeare's interpretation supersedes history and the historical fact of Richard's life. To that degree, following your beautiful paper, would we consider Shakespeare a terrorist of history?
what an interesting question. Yeah, because of his selective memory.
Yeah,
Just look at
for
it.
artistic purposes
Right,
and
yeah,
for the context of the history that he finds himself in,
Yeah.
but completely over superseding the historical fact of a monarch who may or may not have been anywhere near the terror that we remember.
And, okay, and so we have to look at what it is that the terrorist is killing. Richard and these people, the selection of people that I chose in this gallery of terrorists, killed human beings, either directly or ordered their execution or through their failed policies. But when we ask that of the artist, he's not killing people. You could kind of stretch it metaphorically, say, well, he's killing their reputations in a way. But I think they're not in the same moral sphere. I think we'd have to.
I think anyone would concede that.
Yeah. But I think the bigger point is how much of history is invented by people, and it depends on who won the war. And as you point out, the Tudors are on the throne, so Shakespeare's monarch is a Tudor, and he writes for a Tudor society, and so they're going to look like heroes. And Richard is the enemy; he's the Yorkist leader. That's interesting. But even more than history, what for me about this play stuns me each time are these scenes where he's one-on-one with someone. And he's so terrifying. I mean, he kneels before the woman, puts a knife in her hand. He's killed her husband and her father-in-law. Takes it, puts it under his neck and says, "Do it!" And she freezes. And then we infer here, I'm inferring from the text itself, that she realized, there's something really, she always knew there was something intense about him, but there's something maniacal about him. This is madness. And he can do anything he wants with me. She knows he wants me. And so she feels trapped there like a caged animal. I can't say no, because he can kill me at any time. This is my only recourse, the only way I can be saved, the only way I can save myself, by doing this thing that boggles the mind. So, one could talk about how fear operates here. But the extent that even the categories that these people have, the sort of normal categories of right and wrong, and traditional Judeo-Christian morality, which is what the society had and believed in God, and then afterlife and so on. That Richard is so terrifying that even that is swept. I'll do anything to be saved. And then in the last scene, where there's the priest, and officials, and I'm left speechless. And not that it isn't believable. It is all too believable. And it happens all over the world. Am I willing to put my life at risk, my family's life at risk? As people who were protesting in Iran and in Syria and in Russia, and you take a stand against the people in power. Can you do that? Do you have that freedom of speech in your society, or will it cost you your life? So I think Shakespeare helps us, I think, to think through these things. It's not so easy to do that. It's not so easy to stand up and take a stand and bring forth your voice and say, I beg to differ, I disagree, this is wrong, I don't support this.
Okay, so one more question. Anybody else?
Okay.
If not,
Thank you all for coming. You've been wonderful.
Thank you.
It was great.